I don't think there's any question that historians agree that Lincoln's two greatest literary masterpieces were his second inaugural and the Gettysburg Address. But it's interesting to me that when Lincoln, in each case, was writing them, he revealed privately that he wasn't sure he could say anything new. And so, as a speaker today, talking about the 16th president, I have to reflect the same way. How can I say anything new? How can I say anything fresh? And I guess what I'm bringing then is my thoughts and my perspective, and probably nothing that is absolutely brand new. You know, ironically, all of us think we know something about Lincoln, and we do. But if we were all to be interviewed when we stepped out in the hall, we would all say similar things, because the stories about Lincoln, the most profound and the most well-known, are ones that are captured and encapsulated in our memory. But you know, the real Lincoln, despite the fact that so much has been written, so much study and analysis has been done, he still remains kind of elusive. And that sounds like a funny statement to make. But think about the titles of books that suggest that. A recent book called The Real Lincoln. Another book called Lincoln Revisited. Another book from the past, Myths After Lincoln. Another book called The Lincoln That Nobody Knows. Another book called Lincoln Reconsidered. All of that suggests that we are still trying to find and understand the real Lincoln. Well, I think one of the challenges of Abraham Lincoln is the vastness of the literature. It is absolutely huge. In 1945, a historian named J. Monahan did a bibliography. In 1945, he was able to catalog 3,958 titles. That's a lot about one person. Well, today, articles in books about Abraham Lincoln now number 16,000. And if you go on just Barnes & Noble's website, you will be able to find for sale about 2,500 titles about Abraham Lincoln. I believe that writing a biography, one of the greatest challenges is to be objective. When is the last time, there are a few exceptions, but when's the last time that you've read a good biography and in the summary at the end, the author concludes that his subject was a rascal, a scoundrel, an unsavory person, and not worth remembering? Pretty darn rare. Well, I'm having my first opportunity to write biography, and this happens to be a baseball player, and I'm concerned with objectivity because I'm a co-author, and my co-author is the daughter of the Hall of Fame member. I think we're doing pretty well, but objectivity is a challenge, and it's a huge challenge with Abraham Lincoln, because I believe that our judgments of Lincoln, and perhaps about any person that we would write about, are controlled in part by our emotions. Certainly it's fair to say that Lincoln is an American and almost a world icon, that his whole being is shrouded with affection and pride and reverence. And let me make a confession. The simple truth is that I have a hard time reading a book that's overly critical of Lincoln. And I'm trying to force myself to not be so biased and to look at what historians are saying today. And so recently I tackled one of those. I sometimes put myself in a situation that I'm a graduate student, and I actually each year make a reading list for myself and put things on the reading list that may be challenging, and I hold my feet to the fire and say, Bill, this is what you're going to read this year, and then you can read other things after that. So I picked up Michael Lynn's book called What Lincoln Believed. And you know, most of us that love to read like to read before we go to sleep. Is that some of you that way too? I read every night, and it's one of the ways that I draw close to peace and tranquility, and it's just a wonderful feeling. I don't go anywhere without a book, and when I'm traveling I read even more than that. Well, Michael Lynn's book is so acidic when it comes to Abraham Lincoln that I finally quit reading it before I went to bed, because instead of making me feel restful, and peaceful. It got me all stirred up, and I wanted to get to my computer and write him a letter and tell him what I thought. It's almost like he was tampering with the flag. Well, Lincoln is the most revered person in our history, but we have to remind ourselves that as President of the United States, he did not enjoy that level of approbation. He was what historians called the unpopular Mr. Lincoln. Most of the newspapers were opposed to the wartime president, and I want to share some illustration. William Cullen Bryant of the New York Evening Post said, quote, "I am so utterly disgusted with Lincoln's behavior that I cannot muster respectful terms in which to write to him." The New York Herald was especially abusive, calling Lincoln, quote, "a joke incarnated." In another evaluative statement, the editor of the Herald, a famed writer, James Bennett, wrote in 1864, quote, "As President of the United States, he must have the sense enough to see and acknowledge that he is a remarkable failure." Many of the comments about Lincoln were truly belittling and personal. The British minister, Lord Lyons, claimed that the new president had not demonstrated, quote, "any natural talents to compensate for his ignorance of everything but Illinois village politics," end of quote. And the London Times described the U.S. system of government, quote, "as a cheap and simple form of government, having a rural attorney for sovereign." Well, we know that Lincoln was not a beautiful person, not a handsome man, but boy, did those who didn't like him really take on his physical features. One of the oft-repeated stories that I want to tell again because I like it so much is the story goes that Lincoln was out walking in the woods and he came upon a really rough and rugged looking hunter, and the hunter had a musket, and he drew his musket and drew a bead on Lincoln, and Lincoln said, "Whoa, what are you doing, stranger?" And this man said, "Well, let me tell you, man, the settlement that I live in, I've been told that if I ever meet another human being that's uglier than I am, I should kill him. And I have met him." And Lincoln took a long pause and said, "Well, sir, if I'm really uglier than you are, go ahead and shoot, because I don't want to live any longer." The Chicago Times, you may remember, was very, very anti-war and took on Lincoln with great glee. It wrote, "His gestures seemed positively painful, like those of a man suffering from an attack brought on by an imprudent indulgent in unripe fruit." I think that probably came after the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But in the perspective of time, Lincoln has emerged bigger than life. Historians have repeatedly judged him the greatest president that we've ever had. The first evaluation was done by Arthur Schlesinger Sr. in 1948, and Lincoln topped the list. Every single evaluation survey of presidential greatness has put Lincoln at the top of the list. Well, how did they make those judgments? Probably the most important. To be at the top of the list, the president has to be involved in a turning point in history. But they looked at things like strength, integrity, commitment to principle, and obviously accomplishments. And of course, way up at the top of the list also is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Turning point in history, he had a terrible World War and a depression. I always smile when I think about what Teddy Roosevelt thought, because he didn't rank way up at the top, and he said, "Yeah, sure, that darn Lincoln, he had a war, I didn't have one." Except that Spanish-American War, which wasn't much of a war. Well, the exceptional challenges that Lincoln faced, the stage that he served on, represents the opportunity for either greatness or failure, and that's the basis of my remark.